All right, this is the third attempt to start recording our first Understanding Poetry presentation. We'll be looking at different tools we can use to analyze poems. We'll start with level one, which is looking at the structure and what I call the count. Um, in poetry, how the poems are organized, like in terms of the blocks or the units that poems use to separate their ideas, is really important. But equally important is the number of syllables or counts or beats, we might call them, that you find in the lines of the poem. So let's get some vocabulary down to start. So number one, line, and this basically is referring to one idea or one sentence or one kind of line of writing in a poem. Number two is what we call the beat count. This is an extremely important factor in poetry. You have to consider that in ancient poetry, it was very important that you follow a set number of counts within the line. So we measure each line by how many beats we can count within the line, and we call that the beat count. Okay, third point is the rhyme scheme. Now, one of the things that makes poetry quite interesting is that the poets will intentionally pick words at the end of each line that follow some sort of pattern of rhyming with one another. And we usually use the letters of the alphabet to indicate this. So if you had like, he walked along the wall, he took a terrible fall, that would be A, because both of those words rhyme with each other. Now, if it had a pattern where there was a rhyme in line 1 and line 3, line 2, and line 4, that would be AB, AB. Okay, next we're looking at the idea of the stanza. And stanza is basically one chunk of information, almost like a paragraph or a line grouping. And poems can often be made up of several stanzas. Long poems can even be made up of hundreds of stanzas. We'll be looking at poems that are usually, a few stanzas in length. Okay, so now we'll move on to level two. These tools might be ones that you are familiar with. First, simile, indirect comparison using like or as. She's as smart as a fox, or he's as sharp as a whip are some examples. Next is metaphors. So this is a direct comparison. The river raged like an avalanche. Oh no, sorry, that's a simile. The river was an avalanche of water. That would be a metaphor. Next one is personification. Personification is when we give human qualities to a non-human thing. The wind screamed at the top of its lungs would be an example of personification. Alliteration, this is a new idea. And alliteration is when words, the letter at each, the letter that begins each word has the same sound. So we've got an example here. She said 17. They all start with a s or a s sound, right? Said 17. She said 17 secrets would be a way that we could make this sentence even more dense with alliteration. And number nine, another old idea, is symbolism. And this is when one thing in a poem stands for or is symbolic for another thing. So an example would be that ravens symbolize wisdom in Norse mythology because in the Norse system of legend, Odin, the Allfather, had two ravens on his shoulders, and they were called thought and memory. So that's why ravens often symbolize messengers or wisdom if you're talking about Norse mythology. Okay, level three. So we've talked about our structure, and we've talked about some of the tools that we're already familiar with that poets can use to add color and feeling to their poems. But we also have to kind of continue to build this idea that we want to understand the main concepts and themes that are present. So as we know, themes, this is the idea of these classic kind of conflict points or struggles that happen in literature. So poems, just like short stories, will have major themes that they discuss. An example of this, a classic example of this, is humanity versus the natural world. Another example would be what is called pastoralism or pastoral poems, which is the idea that we can find the beauty of God in nature. And many English poets from the early 19th century were very famous for following the pastoral form. Even famous poets like Wordsworth or Keats are known for writing on the pastoral theme. And finally, we can talk about the format or style of the poem because there are some classic poem forms, things like sonnets, odes, laments. Um, there's a whole list of them. Those are three of the most common ones. And so in the example here, sonnets are made up of 14 lines. Each of the lines has 10 syllabic counts in it, and they have a specific rhyme scheme that they have to follow as well. So it's important to understand these formats or styles because they're going to affect what elements we're looking for within the poem. And if you start to notice, this has got this type of a rhyme scheme or this certain type of a beat count in each line, you might have a light go on and say, that's a sonnet or that's an ode. Okay, so then let's move on to the next level, which is how we can analyze a poem. So here are some basic steps that I like to apply. Step one, take a look at the structure. How many stanzas are there? Is there a noticeable pattern within the lines? Step two, count the beats of each line. So you can actually kind of use your fingers to count the syllables. I'll do an analysis in my next video of a short poem, and you'll actually see me do this or hear me doing this. And ask yourself, is there an obvious rhyme scheme going on, and track it. So I've given you the example here of what the rhyme scheme is for a sonnet, one of the forms that we talked about on our last slide. Okay, step three, what other tools jump out as being obvious? So things, again, like metaphor, personification, alliteration, and there is a whole massive encyclopedic list of different poetic devices, and I'll actually show or create a link to a really great site called the Poetry Foundation, which has definitions for all of them. And number four, then you can start to, once you've done all of that kind of core investigation of the basic elements, you start to ask yourself about the themes of the poem. And then this will kind of, if you follow these steps in order, you'll have a fairly strong initial analysis of your poem.